So you said you were in Scotland. Was that doing like rugby, strength and conditioning? Because I know that was a big part of your career.
Yeah. Now, ironically, the Scottish leg was where I worked for the Scottish Institute of Sport. So, just the quick story is that I left DHS on the back of having chatted to my mum's cardiologist, actually, and he just said, "How are you enjoying teaching?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really. It's a job. I really want to get a bit more into exercise and understanding it." And at that point in time, the term sports science didn't exist in my vocabulary. I didn't know there was such a discipline. As we're talking about 1980, 1988 or something. And long story short, he was a classmate of Tim Noakes's at UCT in medical school. And he said, "Well, there's this course in Cape Town. That's a sports science course." And we were just going to go down to Cape Town on a water polo tour, and I was part of the staff. So I called Tim and I arranged to go and meet him and see if I could get on the course. And that's where sports science began for me. But did province and ended up doing the Springboks in 94 as fitness coach, and then rugby turned professional in 95. And I was very fortunate to get one of the first jobs in professional rugby with the Welsh Rugby Union as the head of fitness with the new Directorate of Rugby when rugby went professional for Wales. And that took me and the family to the UK, and we left because of the job. And at the end of that contract, we decided to stay, and it was quite tricky because I didn't really have a profile in the UK at that point in time. But I got the job at the Scottish Institute of Sport as the first S&C coach, the lead S&C coach, when the institute was just being set up. And that, again, was just the right place at the right time. And I ended up spending 13 years in Scotland. So then we moved up there as a family, and that's where we've had our longest shift and where we have the biggest friends. And testimony to that is we've moved back to the original town we moved to go and finish our days. We've got really good friends there and so on. So yeah, the Scottish Institute of Sport, where
Nice.
most of my learning happened, most of the exposure, yeah.
And was that predominantly rugby stuff?
No, so the Scottish Institute of Sport was set up to support Scotland in developing performance and medals in Commonwealth Games and Olympic sports. So it was, and other sports. So when I first began, we had a rugby academy that we set up, and there was no rugby academy in Scotland at the time, and we had sort of senior adolescent rugby players, sort of 16 to 18, and we had a handful, like really, the forerunners, Cassiter and Blair and all those guys were in the academy when we set it up. Some other ones, forwards, a bit backline biased. And then after a while, the governing body took the academies back, but we set up the first academy and ran that from a physical preparation perspective alongside their rugby training. We had only had a small group, maybe 15 a year, that we set up in the beginning, but predominantly we were all Olympic sports. So my most sort of the sports that, so I ended up heading up the Scottish Institute of Sports Strength and Conditioning Department. So it started with just me, and we ended up in 2012, in the 2012 Olympics with, I think it was sort of 6 major venues and 25 full-time staff. And so I ended up predominantly managing that growth, but also I retained certain sports. So up until the Athens Olympics, I worked with Scottish cyclists in British cycling because the English Institute hadn't started by then, and the only way the Scottish guys that were based in Manchester could get S&C support was as Scots from the Scottish Institute. So I used to travel down to Manchester and work with the likes of Chris Hoy and other cyclists. Eventually, I ended up working with all the British cyclists until the English Institute became active, and then I stepped away from that. But at the same time, I started working with canoe slalom, which was based in Nottingham. And again, that didn't change. When the English Institute came along, canoe slalom chose to retain my services until the London Games. And I worked with, through 4 Olympic cycles and multiple medalists, some of them Scottish, some of them not, some of them just British. And it was extremely rewarding, that sort of stuff, and very, very intensive learning from a applying what I known from a sports science and a principles perspective into an applied setting in a situation that was completely novel in the country and growing. You know, so the job that I got in Scotland, I think, was the first ever job in the UK advertised with the term strength and conditioning in the advert. So it was just I was at the front end of the wave, not by any design, just by being there, and it's just been terrific for me to have been there and one, learned from the process, but also develop the relationships and the teams that I have and so on. So that's been great.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how far it's come, you know. So I started studying sports science 2009. I finished off my postgraduate in 2012, and just the way that it's, how you describe it in the late 80s, saying like there was no such thing as a strength and conditioning specialist or sports science or anything like that, is something that's completely foreign to me, because it was just an option immediately out of the gate. If you're passionate about sport and you wanted to help people with movement and their health and that sort of thing, it's always been accessible to people my age and younger. And it's amazing to see how these opportunities have continued to develop, and how with globalization these opportunities continue to expand people's horizons, with being able to coach different or train different sports teams, different codes. But what's interesting to me about what you've just said is you've clearly trained athletes at a very high level in a variety of different sports. Now, as a strength and conditioning specialist myself, I know that can also be something that is a little bit out of the comfort zone, because it's easy to get very niche and training specifically rugby strength and conditioning, or in my case, I'm almost exclusively golf. How was that process from a professional development standpoint, going from being almost exclusively rugby to then into very elite sports across Commonwealth and Olympic Games?
It's really interesting, and it touches on one of my beliefs about applied sports science, and something that I've had to sort of communicate and deal with throughout my career, primarily because of the role I've had in recruiting people into roles, and the progress of that development of specialisms and so on. My personal view, and fairly strong view, is that our specialism, you and I, is sports science, and the customer shouldn't make a difference. We apply the same principles to whoever we face. And for sure, the requirement of us, and in some of the more up-to-date texts for applied application of sports science for fitness, either in strength and conditioning format for performance sport or for health and rehabilitation, the first requirement of us is to understand the athlete in front of us, and also the target that we're looking to develop that athlete for, whether that's for a return to play because of damaged tissue, or whether it's to achieve another level of athletic performance in that sport. And then we need to investigate and understand that sport as thoroughly as we can, so that we can apply the sports science principles to the physical demands of that sport effectively for that specific athlete standing in front of us. So I'm very clear on that, and I have been sort of challenged on that on a number of occasions by people who come in and apply for jobs and say they are specialist judo strength conditioning coaches because they've been judo players and then converted. And I said, well, then there's no place in my employment for you. You know, I'm looking for someone who, first and foremost, goes to bed as a strength and conditioning scientist, and then will apply himself to whatever faces him in the morning with regards to applying the sports science principles to the demands that are facing from the next challenge that they have. You know, so. Not sure how you feel about that, but that would be my view. And the same with clinical stuff as well, you know. I think it's very similar.
So I think you bring up a good point. I think I think specializing in a particular sport from a business perspective makes a lot of sense, to brand and market yourself as an expert in a particular field. I think if I relate this back to golf fitness, strength and conditioning for golfers has a number of different avenues. One is the athletic development, both short term and long term, of that athlete. And those principles, I think, would remain the same. You know, if you are wanting to get improved power in an athlete that's a golfer, that would look very similar to trying to improve power in a rugby player. Perhaps the weights might vary, but the principles and the fundamentals would remain the same. The other aspect to it would be, where it would be unique to golf, would be an understanding of the golf swing, and then understanding the implications of certain restrictions, be it in mobility, flexibility, or then instabilities, and the impact that that would have on the movement pattern of that person's golf swing themselves. So I think that is where it might be slightly unique. In perhaps you can give me an example of rugby that might contradict what I'm saying, or another sport. But with golf being, number one, such a repetitive sport where there's things like pattern overload and so on, and being a very technique-oriented sport, it's important to really understand the technical dynamic of the swing, and then what implications that might have based on a person's physical capabilities, which might vary in a sport like rugby, for example. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, maybe I'd stop too short there. I think that you're absolutely right. I do fully respect specializing in a sport as a strength conditioning coach. I'm just saying that the fundamental specialism is strength conditioning. So, for example, if I were to begin to work with a sport that I wasn't accustomed to, say, for example, if that was golf, then it would be my requirement to get up to speed as much as I could possibly in the first instance, by looking at the literature, and then by looking at the actual sport and the analysis of the sport through movement and analysis, etc., so that I fully understood the demands of the sport, and I became a specialist as needed for that shift. So specialization in a sport as an S&C coach or as an exercise physiologist is absolutely appropriate. I just say that it comes as a consequence of what faces you. And I agree with you about the business element. I think that's a very strong case, and without a doubt, I think that specialism needs to be developed, and the credibility in that specialism needs to be communicated as part of your marketing, etc. And I understand that. I was just thinking more from a global principle perspective, that the fundamental principles should be on the foundation, and you've clearly covered that. I mean, the requirements for the development of power cross over a heap of sports and would be slightly adjusted as a consequence of the actual execution of that power in the sport in question. You know?
What's interesting, we spoke off air about some things that we would like to cover, and my client base varies from golfers and athletes that are of an elite level in their particular sport, to the general population. So since COVID, I started to take on people who were just general population, looking to get stronger, looking to maybe lose a bit of fat, lose a bit of weight. And it was something that I really saw quite significant growth in that area of my business. And now I sort of have a wide variety of people. But the nature and the way that I train an athlete that is trying to be elite and is trying to do this as a profession varies slightly in the way that I would approach somebody who's not. So, for example, a golfer who's spending most of the time on their feet, they're not spending much time behind a desk, sitting for 8 hours in a car. Their only responsibility is to play golf to the best of their ability and to look after their body and to eat well. There's a different level of requirement, and you can be more demanding of a person who has those aspirations. Whereas somebody who is sitting behind a desk for 8 hours and has 2 kids, and they've got to drop and fetch, and their sleep is disrupted, and the list goes on and on and on. These are not professional athletes, but yet they're trying their best to get fit and healthy. And there's a fine line between balancing how hard you push the general population versus pushing an elite level athlete. And there's an orthopedic cost to exercise, and that is just a part of the business. And whilst I'm clearly a big believer in strength and conditioning, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. But it's an interesting conversation to have, orthopedic cost of the general population, and then follow that up with an elite athlete. Do you have any thoughts on those two populations?
Yeah, for sure. I think in the last, I'd say, decade, my life began as a biokineticist. When I finished my sports science degree with Tim, I just said, then I started thinking, why did I do this? There was no real, there clearly weren't any adverts in any career pages for jobs of a sports science in those days. And most of my classmates on the sports science degree were either physios, there were 2 or 3 medical doctors as well. So it was quite challenging for me. The one thing that did pop up at the time was biokinetics, and UCT wasn't recognized as a place to study biokinetics. So I had to get mentored through my internship with biokinetics by a prof from Stellenbosch, and I completed that. Then I opened Dave Clark Biokinetics in Cape Town. So that was the start of my career, where I had probably anything from 75% of my income coming from cardiac rehabilitation, which we were delivering at a couple of the big gyms in Cape Town, and individual orthopedic rehabilitation that I had sourced through making contacts with medics and physios in the southern suburbs. And the other quarter was just starting to work with Western Province, which ended up growing and overtaking the rest of it. So I have a fairly good view of that at the foundation, but clearly I then went and busied myself with preparing athletes for performance for the next 20 years. And when I finished my PhD, I sort of became quite close to what I call neuromuscular physiology related to resistance training, and understanding that far more deeply than I had. And that continued in the time that I have recently been working in higher education. So I've got a fairly good view on what I think about the physiology and the requirement of that. And I appreciate the way that you've ring-fenced strength conditioning, because strength conditioning often is misdiagnosed, particularly where you are now. You can go and do strength and conditioning sessions at a club where you are doing health and fitness strength conditioning sessions, which isn't the correct use of the term. Strength and conditioning is the discipline that prepares athletes to perform, and that could be recreational athletes all the way up to Olympians. So that's my understanding of the definition, or the definition that I preserve. So yeah, look, I've got fairly strong views about that. I think that you're absolutely right. The two populations are significantly different. I think that there are some clear crossovers from a physiological perspective now. My view is that when I did sports science, the prevailing thinking at the time was we were just coming out of the back of the aerobic revolution. So everything was built around aerobic exercise, and the publications there were overwhelming on how health would be benefited by getting aerobically fit. And it coincided with the access to treadmill and VO2 max testing in very many exercise science labs around the world. So research was just pumped out because that's where the paradigm was. And it's really interesting. It's taken probably a decade for the strength paradigm to overwhelm that with proper science. There is a paper in the literature by a guy called Todd. He's an American, and him and his wife publish a lot of history of sports science and strength and conditioning papers where they've looked at progressions of certain practices, etc. And they've shown that, I'm not sure which decade it is, but the exponential increase in research around resistance training in any element, so for health, for healthy fitness, for rehabilitation, for sport, etc. And they've demonstrated this, and that clearly has played a part in our now clear understanding that the development of muscular strength, and let's just park that now, is your best protection against mortality if compared to other elements of fitness. Clearly, in logical terms, general fitness will still protect you more than anything else. But if you have to make a call, then increasing the volume and function of your muscle mass through resistance training is probably the most meaningful approach to try and protect yourself as we age and go into the phase of life when we get or we're increasingly at risk of lifestyle illnesses.
It's so interesting. You spoke about how research can get skewed over years, not with any malice, but it just happens. You do a study like with the cardiac revolution and the VO2 and the aerobic training, and you do your at that stage, what was it, 3 times a week, like 60 minutes 3 times a week, and they prove something, they hypothesize something, it then becomes successful, and then they were correct, and then they do another study, and then that study says, okay, well, let's off the back of that, and then we'll do something slightly different, but it's all they're all going down the aerobic rabbit hole, so to speak. And then, for example, repeated sprints or interval training gets kind of left behind, and then 10 years later, then all of a sudden we realize, oh, wow, repeated sprints are actually much better for us than we originally thought. And we were just going down the aerobic rabbit hole. And then now it's caught up with the resistance. So It's also, I think, an important note for the listener who takes an interest in their health and their wellness, to understand these cycles of long-term research, and that things do tend to, for one reason or another, get skewed and there's different seasons and there's different focal points. But I'm certainly grateful to see that the resistance training era has arrived. No thanks to anything else. But it is interesting that with people who train over the age of 50, as testosterone starts to dip, especially in men, and as women start to feel like they're becoming a bit more fragile, and menopause and so on, there's this fine line between loading them to the point where it's dysfunctional, the movement pattern that is, because it can be very easy to make the mistake of, okay, we're just going to go and do weight training. And you go out there and you train these people and you give them a whole bunch of weight training exercises to do, and they're just not really well equipped to handle that sort of load. So I think it's important. A screening process is very important, whereby we can really isolate, together with medical history, what is this person about? What do they do? What is their lifestyle like? Do they have any previous injuries, illnesses, anything, any chronic pain? And then thereafter, you can adjust and apportion it. So we spoke about Michael Boyle off the show as well. He has a rule where, and this is a rule of thumb, it's not a research-backed rule, but in training the elderly population, he has a rule with along the lines of, whatever your age is, that's the percentage of the workout that should be mobility based. So if you're 70 years old, your workout should be predominantly flexibility and mobility, and then the other 30% strength. As a rule of thumb, I'm not sure now that there's more research that's come out that is going to be completely on point, but it's an interesting school of thought. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that firstly, I'd like you to clarify a couple of terms that slipped by me there. What do you mean by orthopedic cost?
So orthopedic costs, in my understanding, in the context of this interview, would be the cost of getting into the gym and potentially picking up a niggle, performing an exercise that perhaps wasn't done correctly, the load on the joints, for as an example, a poor posture when they do an exercise. Because not everybody is going to, for example, have access to a trainer, right, where we can correct and we can make sure that the exercise is done correctly. So from that standpoint, that's what I mean in this context by orthopedic cost.
Okay. So I'm fully aware and cognizant of the fact that there is a challenge in bringing the elderly and even younger people who are historically sedentary and who don't have a sporting history or who don't have an exercise history, the gulf between them remaining sedentary or embarking on an exercise program is something that hasn't ever really been investigated clearly. I've got personal views about that. I think that people like yourself and people that are successful in the industry work out much more about the psychological bridging of that gap in such a way that they take the threat and the fear of a new environment, new activities out of the situation, especially in the first period until that endeavor or that process of going to exercise on a regular basis becomes part of a routine. And then it is appropriate to start bringing on the more of the challenge that might have scared them off earlier on. Whatever way you manipulate that, I think that that's a really, really important junction where that is predominantly a failure across the world in any environment for any exercise specialist. In any conversation you have with anybody, there's never that discussion. They're always talking about the ideal program and what the return will be and what the evidence is, or just what the absolute nonsense is on social media about what the best exercise. So one way or another, they're talking about the exercise and the return, but not the process to get people on board. So regards Boyle's formula, I'm a bit more closely following a guy called Stuart Phillips. He's Canadian. I think it's Newfoundland university out there, and he did a whole lot on protein. And now he's had the courage as a professor to retract that and say there's more to protein, and particularly protein works best on the back of resistance training, and that has a positive effect. But not just heavy resistance training. It could be hill walks, So he's very good in that way. But he's also, as a consequence of his history, if you see him on LinkedIn, he's also connected to people who are doing the cutting edge research on the effect of resistance training in the elderly population or in the less trained population. Particularly of interest for me is the sedentary clinical populations, the obesity, the people with heart disease, because those things can all have significant benefit from the appropriate level of introduction for exercise and have a positive effect on their medical bill and their life. I think that the statement that I would say is probably the most accurate for anybody embarking on exercise as an elderly person is just whatever it's going to take for this program that we're introducing to become consistent, we will adhere to that. And once it's consistent, then we'll adjust it to be effective. Because I think that in life, consistency of exposure is the one characteristic that's not negotiable. The people that are healthier as a consequence of their level of physical activity is as a consequence of extended years of consistent exposure. And I'm not even fussed about whether at this point in time that is walking or that is physical activity, although I have a really aggressive view about selling physical activity in the form of exercise for medicine, because it's not. You can't dose physical activity effectively, whereas you can dose exercise accurately. So that is my view about that in response to your question.
What has surprised you the most about your learnings about resistance training? we all have preconceived ideas of what we think might be the case when we look at research and when we think about the industry at large. Is there anything that comes to mind where you think, oh wow, I got that wrong, or wow, that was more significant or less significant than I thought?
It's difficult because I guess it's been drip fed. You know, I was the one thing that I'm sort of fairly proud of is that when I finished sports science at UCT, it was such a learning for me, and at a time that I'd almost gone down a teaching route, and I was thinking what I'd wear as a headmaster, and you know, for me to have discovered sports science was an epiphany. And ironically, I really struggled through that course, and I think I came second to last on the course, and just really worked hard to try and get through it. And I made contacts there that I retained for the rest of my life. You know, the staff that were there become lifelong friends. I followed on with doing an MSc by research with one of them as my supervisor, looking at strength training for rugby players and the role of supervision. And then I came back, and years later, one of the things that you talked about with regards to exercise research creating a gimmick. And the other one that really took us to the cleaners as strength and conditioning coaches from the year 2000 around about was core stability, and how you could really develop your trunk stability for performance in sport by abdominal bracing. And there was scientific evidence from some group in Australia and Sydney that was later refuted by them, ironically, but that drove the content of my PhD. And so the thing that surprised me the most, and still does, is the absence of understanding of the impact of compound strength training. So in other words, strength training done in a standing position, particularly where the load is above the shoulders. So either Olympic lift or a partial Olympic lift that's caught above the shoulders, or a classic squat, front squat, back squat, or overhead squat. The categorization of those exercises as being predominantly the triple extension, so the hip and the knee joint are doing the work for those exercises, is flawed. The extent to which those exercises play a part in developing the most functional trunk strength that you can ever seek in any exercise. And it doesn't have to be advanced, hard, loaded compound exercises. And a compound exercise requires that kinetic part of that part of the kinetic chain, the trunk from the pelvic girdle up until the shoulder girdle, is braced and stable for those exercises to work. And as a consequence, you get automatic trunk stability development through those exercises. And that's been, you know, the still to this day, I work in groups, and people will coach that exercise, and there will never be a conversation with the athlete about, you do understand, because if you're developing squat strength in an athlete for the first time, and regardless of the age, and they are working up from learning the exercise to where they can squat 1.5 times their body weight, for example, the predominant adaptation in that journey is in the trunk. So they could get off the squat rack and go into a leg press, and they leg press more than they're squatting. So their legs aren't being challenged by that squat yet. But the lever that's going to allow them to challenge their legs more effectively and more dynamically so that their golf ball goes further is happening once the trunk lever is developed appropriately. And also the other thing that's really important for me is that trunk lever is so vital in all of the sport we talk about. In everything that I've mentioned to you here is fundamental, and even where it's not logical. So for example, in golf or in boxing, for example, the power and the speed at the end of the glove on a punch is predominantly the product of the force on the contralateral leg through the ground. And there is evidence for that. And as a consequence, if you leak power through your trunk, in that your force of your punch will be less.
Yes.
So that was probably the biggest sort of area, and an area that still isn't championed as much as I think it should be.
Mm. Let's pick that apart a little bit, because we've got such a wide variety of squats. I mean, we know people talk about functional strength and functional training. There's not many other movement patterns that come to mind that are more functional than a squat. I mean, if I look at how we develop as babies, my son is 2.5 years old, and we don't have to coach him how to squat properly. I watch and admire, and I'm hell of a jealous about the squat positions he can get into. So it's something that is part of our development as human beings. But you mentioned back squat, front squat. We can go goblet squat, so a kettlebell or a dumbbell in front of the chest. Do you have any preferences in terms of where we place the weight?
So it's by need. It's by need. So if we work back from, if you place someone in front of me that is looking to be the next tight head for the Springboks, there's no question that he needs to develop he needs to optimize his strength in the squat movement to be in that position, without a doubt. And as a consequence, the most effective exercise there is the back squat. The heaviest load we can move through that movement is the back squat. It's a bilateral movement, it's the most controlled, and it's extremely safe if done in the rack. So it is the one for developing maximal strength. So sprint cyclists, 2.35% of their body mass, we're aiming for that. They're going through back squat. That doesn't mean to say there may be parts of the cycle where we can flip that around and do a cycle with a front squat at fairly high load, because we change the it's a variation. In real terms, from a neuromuscular perspective, the change on the muscle demand isn't significant in front and back squat, apart from the fact that with the back squat, I can take it much higher because it's much more stable in that position, and I've got less work to remain upright and carry that load through the full range of movement. So, and again, if I'm working with a swimmer, then the overhead squat is really important because it retains a range with the arm positions in a way where that flexibility is probably very important for the swim stroke. And as a consequence, I'm generating strength through the range, and also, crucially, trunk stability with my arms in the position where they're either going to enter the water or exit the water, whether I'm doing freestyle or fly or backstroke or fly and breaststroke for that matter. So it's a flexibility retention exercise, but also linked with developing strength through the full range of that movement at the same time. So it's by need. And again, if we come to people doing it for health, and also if we go to the single leg, the rear foot elevated single leg squat, wonderful examples of when the need is there, like rehabilitation situations, or if I'm working with an athlete that has a clear need for working each leg singly, then those are very useful exercises. But we have to be really clear on that, the fact that no matter how hard we train or how intense we load a single leg squat, whether it's dumbbells in the hand or barbell on the back or goblet squat, we can never get close to what the front squat would be or what the back squat would be. In the situation of exercise for health, one of the things that I think is clearly missed, if we follow the strength rule is primarily as a consequence of the fact that through strength training, we elevate the metabolism that is required by the muscle on a 24-hour basis. So the more muscle that I have that is resistance trained, it doesn't need to be extremely strong and powerful. It just needs to be stronger than it was 3 months ago relative to where I came from. And as a consequence of the fact that the volume of muscle mass that we keep active and strong is the marker that will have an impact on our health, because the increased demand of that muscle that is placed on our cardiovascular system 24 hours a day is one of the returns that we get from being stronger. So then it's quite naive to bypass the hips and the muscles about the hips, because that's the biggest junction. So if you could find any way in a healthy adult who wants to embark on exercise, loaded flexion extension of the hip muscles is crucial. And I just say, find your own way to load it. But if you want, I think we all have an obligation to try and get to where we can be like your son or daughter.
Son.
Be like him and still squat as soon as you feel a bit wobbly, all the way down to your butt to the floor. That's our human movement. And it's achievable. Everybody can retain that. I mean, when I arrived in Cape Town, I'd never seen a squat in my life to study sports science. And now I'm squatting, a substantial load, and with body weight, I can sit down and cast a rod and sit around a poikie and on my haunches, etc. So that range has come back because I've used the squat over the years to, one, redevelop it, and two, retain it. So it's one of the benefits of loaded flexibility work.
So there's a couple of things there that I'd like to elaborate on. One, if you've got more muscle mass, I think for the people out there that are thinking about fat loss and weight loss, if you've got more muscle mass, then you're also more metabolically active, because the heart has to pump blood and oxygen to the working muscles, and if you've got more muscles doing the work, then you're going to burn more calories. So there's your fat loss aspect to it. Everybody loves to talk about, you must burn more calories than you put in if you want to lose weight and so on. So there is already a perfect example of the importance of resistance training. So you'll, by nature, burn more calories on a daily basis if you have more muscle mass. The second thing that I'd like to chat about, that you spoke about, the rear foot elevated split squat, is a concept out there called bilateral deficit, which promotes your unilateral exercises like your split squats or your rear foot elevateds. And the theory is that, for example, if I go and if I load, let's say 30 kg dumbbells in each hand for a rear foot elevated split squat, that's 60 kilos of weight that's being driven through that leg. And then that would be easier to get 60 kgs driving through that leg, as opposed to then trying to do that through a squat or a deadlift, where I would have to then do 120 kgs. So do you have any feelings about that sort of thing? Because, for example, if I translate this back to my gym, to give you some context, with my general population, I don't do back squats very often. I tend to, unless they progress to being quite heavy on the goblet squat, because I find that the position for them to get the bar in, with the external rotation, that, number one, a lot of people being excessively kyphotic, so very hunched and rounded, find it difficult just to sit the bar in the right place as a start. And then if we take that out, and then we haven't even begun to talk about the hips and what happens there if they've got the range of motion. Whereas I find if somebody's got the weight in front, then it's a lot easier for them to promote better squatting technique. So if they get really proficient at that, then we move on to the bar. My elite athletes are a different conversation, but the gen pop, certainly. The second thing is that as a result, I tend to spend more time, and anybody who's trains with me in the gym will know this because they hate this bloody exercise. I do rear foot elevated split squats, and I do normal split squats on a weekly basis. Very seldom will a client come through the gym where they don't do one of those two, if not both those exercises at some stage throughout the course of the week. And my thinking is for that reason. The bilateral deficit, a safe way to load them and to develop strength in the glutes and the quads in particular, and to do such where I can try and maximize the amount of resistance that I'm loading them with. Do you have any thoughts on that theory?
Yeah, look, I think that what I've said a little earlier is, when I'm working with the non-athletic population, I think that the introduction of a squat movement using the goblet squat with a dumbbell in front is really, really good because it does put the load in a position that forces the trunk upright. And the crucial point there is where I think many people err is that it's almost certain that if someone's never done this before, they're going to have a very limited range of movement. And having the patience to gradually use that load to regain that range of movement with very, very light to moderate loads is appropriate. And also, as I said earlier, I think another thing that's very often overlooked is it's all relative to that person's status, exercise and fitness status at the point of departure, at the point of start. So if they'd never squatted before or never done anything like that, then a goblet squat, a single leg version of the squat is all appropriate because it represents a progression on previously, and the capacity to continue to progress that for a period of time is built in. It will happen. I mean, it'll take a while before they grow out of that as a consequence of strength development. So I think that in that population, those are two terrific examples or good examples. I think the one that I have a view about in the back of my head for the future, where we are trying to train people in a safe environment through the squat movement, is the hack squat. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I think the hack squat machine that is commonly available these days is still quite a heavy, cumbersome, plate-loaded machine, and it's probably a bit incompatible for exercise, for health, and for the elderly. But one of the ideas I have is to try and think about creating a design of a hack squat machine where it's much more lighter weight, maybe with a stack, so that you can come in and sit with your back in a squat position with straight legs on a platform and have a pin loaded setup so that it's much more agile and suitable for that population. But as I said, it's entirely up to us to be creative in the way in which we load the hip joint, the hip and knee function to develop that strength and to increase the range of movement. So I think those two free load exercises, the single leg rear foot elevated squat and the goblet squat, are terrific exercises. And it would take many people a long time before the load that they can put in their dumbbell in their hands becomes too light. It probably gets unplayable sooner because you can't hold the load as opposed to the load.
More of a grip strength thing than anything else.
Exactly. The one thing I wanted to mention, you talked about muscle mass, because one of the other red flags is often mentioned. We're trying to lose weight and look slimmer, and we don't want all this muscle. Although, having said that, in a certain age group, that's become quite acceptable now to put a bit of muscle on in certain parts of the body. But for most, the promise that you're going to increase your muscle mass as a consequence of doing resistance training is not really desirable. But I think we all know that you can package the resistance training in such a way from a volume and intensity perspective that increases muscle density in the first instance as opposed to circumference to that extent. And it's also very genetic. I think that some people who do train with resistance will get bigger. But still, in that instance, if we package that intensity with a shorter rep range, we will minimize that hypertrophy and maximize the strength and the density of the muscle. I think there's fairly good evidence for both of those sort of observations.
Yeah, that's true. I think, two things on that. The first thing is that it was particularly true with females. They felt like they didn't want to bulk up and they didn't want to all of a sudden get big and masculine. But now with the research with strength and conditioning, particularly in females, that sort of misconception is, thank goodness, been sort of overturned. And I think I've noticed a massive mindset shift in that aspect of female strength and conditioning and women wanting to get into shape. that they realize the necessity for maintaining their muscle mass. And even more so with the different hormonal makeup when compared to men, even more so the need for effective trunk stability. They are by nature more flexible and mobile than men, but at the same time, they need to be able to then control that mobility and flexibility, which brings us back to the trunk stability and the importance of resistance training. The second thing that I wanted to mention, as far as that is concerned, I've hit a blank now. You mentioned the resistance training. I'll come back to it at some stage. I think it will pop into my head. But it's a hugely important aspect to strength and conditioning on a long-term basis, is to make sure that you try your best to lift heavy weights, and you try to do so. I think a reasonable amount would be, for somebody who's not doing it much, 2 to 3 times a week at the very least, and to do so within a range. Oh, there it is. It's come back to me. The misconception about heavy lifting and resistance training, and then that coming at the cost of range of motion or mobility. That is a huge thing that I've worked really hard to overturn, particularly in the golfing population, where a guy will come in and he'll be like, oh, I just want to work on my flexibility and my rotation, and I just don't want to get too tight from the resistance training, from the weight training. And that's been a massive thing to try and overcome that misconception, that if you train a movement pattern, and if you're able to do so under load, and as a result you can do so through a larger range of motion, then your mobility through that joint is going to improve. It's not going to decrease. I think people have this misconception. I understand why they do so, but they have this misconception of a big bodybuilder, walking around like he's carrying 2 watermelons under his armpits, and thinking that that's, and can't even brush his teeth because his biceps so big, and they think that, well, that's because he's lost range of motion because his muscles, he's done too much weight training. But it's a massive misconception that if you perform adequate strength training and you do so through a full range of motion, your mobility in those joints are going to improve.
Yeah, and more than that, Clint, the strength through the outer range increases. So, and particularly important for golfers. So where potential damage occurs in any athlete is outer range control, and as a consequence, too much momentum in the outer range leading to the turnaround point, and as a consequence, muscle damage. So exactly right. With the PhD, I showed that in the back squat, I did parallel back squats, so parallel strictly to where the top of the thighs are horizontal. And I had, I was looking at trunk muscle activation through different loads of the squat to see if increasing the load increased the stimulus, and therefore we can logically say, if you squat heavier, you're going to have a greater stimulus on your trunk muscle activation, and therefore there's greater training effect. Not only did I show that, but I showed that in the eccentric phase down to parallel, and in the concentric phase up, the final 30 degrees before parallel results in the highest trunk muscle activation, and also the highest vastus lateralis activation in that exercise. And I think there is other evidence to show that if you go below the horizontal, so in all of athlete environments that I've ever worked, we start by training the full squat. And we develop technique in that full squat on the understanding that we will begin to load the full squat, but that full squat's not negotiable. So if you're going to end up squatting 1.5 times your body mass, and you're going to talk about this to your friends, it's going to be 1.5 times body mass to the full squat for that very reason. Unless there are factors that there may have been previous knee surgery, or there's historical lumbar issues that may prevent that depth, etc., etc. But in most cases, in all of the athletes I'm working with here, we've established a blanket rule for full squat. And the primary reason there is that they're combat sport athletes, and the work that they do in that full range very often requires a level of strength. And now they're going to have strength in that range never had before, and probably won't exist in any other athletes in Kingdom of Saudi. So that will give us an advantage.
Yeah.
But it
That's
happens in
fantastic.
other ranges as well. So if you do a range and you do strength through that range, that strength range is really important.
Mm.
Look, I think along the way, when I first began in those days working with Western Province, uh, aerobic exercise and strength exercise were the underpinning stuff. So when I played rugby all the way to, through my life, and I used to run 3 times 8K a week, and that was my rugby training, And I know now that it was flawed, And so what I know now is that resistance training is the basis, and the most compatible endurance training for that is interval type training, and you touched on that. And the research shows that. So the intermittent anaerobic type work has clearly less likelihood to switch off the strength signal and is more compatible to that. And we also know now that packaged correctly, the anaerobic interval type training that is sport specific will improve both aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity required for that sport. So that's probably a mind change. I'm not saying recently, because I think that's evolved over the last 30 years. But it's quite clear to me now. So that describes the way I exercise for my personal health, and it's the way I would package it for all athletes where it's an intermittent sport.
Yeah, fantastic, man. What a wonderful way to finish. If you could leave us with one thought on health and wellness. You said you obviously take your own health and wellness quite seriously. If you could impart one piece of advice to somebody who is listening to this and they're wanting to get a bit stronger, get a bit healthier, what would it be?
So I think the thing that always claws away at me is when we're trying to get people into the gym for the reason of health. So to get fit so that you can live a better life, be happier, and be healthier for longer. The concept that I'm going to go to the gym, so it's going to be hard, and I'm going to have time to recover. I need time to recover from that, and it's going to be sore, and it's going to be negatively impactful on me for a period of time. My view quite clearly is the two things I've said. I think interval sessions and strength sessions, albeit for the first week, might be like the tire hitting the tarmac. It is quite challenging and there will be muscle soreness. But thereafter, the actual concept of that work is far less to overcome in your head once you're used to that than going in to do 40 minutes on the treadmill at a steady state pace. That used to be what we were advising people. And then long circuits of 20 exercises. So all we need to do now is hip flexion and extension, or hip hinge under load, and push-pull in the upper body, so you get the chest and the back working. And do that on a progressive load for about 10 repetitions, so you can't do 12. And do that 3 times a week. And where time's tough, you can drop to 2 times, but just make it easy. And that's so much easier to get your head around than an extensive, hard aerobic type training with long, multiple strength exercise workouts. That probably for me is the message that I tell at dinner parties here. So we're not here, but
Yeah,
when
yeah.
I'm socializing.
Yeah. Well, Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure, man. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I wish you safe travels back to Mzansi as you head out there from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Hey everyone. A huge amount of work and effort goes into producing this podcast, whether it's from the research going into the episode, whether it's finding the guests coming to the location, or them being online, to producing the content, edited and putting it in a format that is conducive to your ears and your eyes. And it goes a really, really long way if you can just do me one thing in return for this free content: share it. Share it far and wide, and if you find an episode useful, send it to someone who might feel the same way. That's all. Thanks a million. See you next week.